Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for the latest set that just dropped on Arena, which is the Alchemy Aetherdrift set, and I'm also going to be talking about the new rebalances that have just gone live as well. So if you're not aware, the new set and these rebalances went live yesterday. I've not had much of a chance to play with them, so this set review is just going to be my first take on the cards, what I think of them, where I think they're likely to see play in Alchemy and Historic. Now obviously the Alchemy cards are also going to be legal in Timeless as well, but spoiler alert, I don't think any of these cards are going to be good enough to see play there, but that's kind of unsurprising because of how high the power level is in that set. Additionally, I'm also going to be doing an MTGA Zone Premium article all about new decks built around these cards and the rebalance cards, some theory craft, and then that'll be out this weekend, so hopefully I'll have had time to tweak those lists a bit, figure out what's working and what's not, and then if I do come up with some lists that are working really well, I'll also have some videos to cover with new deck guides with these cards over the coming few weeks as well. But anyway, with that all out of the way, let's just get straight into it. So I'm going to start off here by having a look at the rebalances, and from my experience, unless the rebalances are targeted at Historic, they tend to rebalance the Alchemy cards around best of one from what I've seen, and I do have to admit I haven't played Alchemy best of one in a really long time, and I'm not fully up to date with the best of three metagame. I haven't played it in a few weeks at this point, so by the way, I still have a decent idea of what's going on in the format, so I should have a good idea of where these cards are aimed at. So first of all, Golden Sidekick, moving from a 2-2 to a 1-3. I don't think this is a huge nerf for the Bats deck, honestly, because the passive ability is the main thing, and that deck is built around gaining life in a variety of other ways as well. But I do understand what they're going for here, starting to give your creature +2/+2 straight away, even if you have no other life gain, does start to snowball really quickly. So moving it from a 2-2 to a 1-3 does limit how powerful Sidekick is on its own, but I still don't think this changes how good the card is. I mean, it does make the card slightly worse, but I don't think it makes it any less playable, really, because the decks that you want to be playing this card in are going to have a ton of life gain synergies anyway, and the real power is the passive ability. So this will limit the ability of Sidekick to solo the game on its own, but I don't think it really changes its viability in the bat decks that tend to play it. Impetuous Lootmonger creates a tapped treasure rather than an untapped one, which I do think is a nerf, right? I think one of the most powerful things that the heist deck can do is get the getaway enchantment in play alongside one or two Lootmongers, and then you can just chain a bunch of spells together and really go off. Obviously making trap treasure tokens does slow that down slightly. Again, I don't really think that's going to change the viability of the card. It will just limit its power level slightly. So I don't think this is going to make a huge difference, really, just a slight nerf to the heist decks. This card does see some play in Historic, and this is going to be a nerf there as well. But again, the treasure entering untapped isn't a massive deal, really. I think most decks that play Lootmonger in Historic are using it as a discard outlet rather than trying to maximize the heist part of it, if that makes sense. But again, I don't think this one's likely to make a huge difference in Alchemy. Then next up we got Buxton Decorated Host, which is one I was a little bit surprised about. I haven't really seen this card much when I was playing Alchemy. Again, this could be a best of one thing, which might be why I'm not aware of it, or it could be, if Convoke in best of three has suddenly cropped up over the past few weeks, then maybe that explains why. But if this is a prominent deck in best of one and people are consistently getting Buxton out on turn 3, that is really powerful. I have played with this card. When it launched, I was excited to try out Convoke and Alchemy again because we still had a Mara legal, so you got two really powerful payoffs for it. My issue with that deck, though, was that the mana base was a little bit awkward and the enablers weren't that great, but, I haven't played that list in a while, so we could have had good new additions since Aetherdrift, perhaps. But either way, I don't really think this is likely to have a massive impact in the best of 3 metagame from what I've seen. Obviously, this is a big nerf to Buxton specifically. I still think it's probably playable in Alchemy Convoke because you do need a decent number of payoffs and, it's still going to be castable. But outside of that, I don't really expect this to have a big impact. I have seen this see play in some Historic decks. I tested it out in, very heavy Convoke lists early on, and I know Arnie's been trying it in Yawgmoth recently as well. So it does kind of suck when these Alchemy rebalances affect some fringe decks in Historic, but again, I haven't seen a ton of this card in either format, so I don't think this is going to be a massive one, unless, like I said, best of 3 Convoke has suddenly picked off recently. Then next up, we got Ethrimik Imagine Fiend, which is another card that, when it came out, I was really confused about what deck it sees play in. Surprisingly, it's basically seen play nowhere, and they've increased the power level on this slightly where you're now guaranteed to manifest Dread when it ETBs, but again, I'm not really a big fan of this card. It's kind of pulling you in different directions. Now it kind of fits better into a go wide shell because you're guaranteed the extra token. So it's kind of like an Anthem effect that turns into a creature if they remove all of your other stuff. But again, like I said, the only decks that would really want that are very go wide decks like Convoke. So maybe now Buxton's got worse, you could try Ethrimik instead. But again, like the Convoke decks didn't really seem that powerful to me. So I just imagine this is probably going to continue to see no play, but it's nice that it is now slightly closer to playability. Then next up we got Wingbright Thief, which is one that I'm pretty excited about in Alchemy. So this card at 3 mana felt very underwhelming to me, really. I think the effect is, powerful on a 2 mana creature because, you can play it on turn 2, target their 3-drop or just the card they're most likely to play next turn, and then it puts the opponent in a conundrum where they either have to delay their best play or just run it out and draw you a card and gain you a bit of life. And just the curve out with this card seems so much better in a number of different decks. So first of all, they mention the Awestruck Signet here, which is a card that I think is very, very powerful if you can build around it, and I have seen it see a decent amount of play, but the issue is that the other cards you have to run in order to make the Signet good weren't always that good, whereas I think a card like Wingbright Thief is decent at that. It's also an enchantment creature with flying, which is really relevant for... I've forgotten the name of it now. There's a 3 mana black creature that... whenever an enchantment creature connects in combat, you get just to cast a card from the opponent's deck. So being able to curve this into that on turn 3 seems really powerful to me as well. So I do think that this card is significantly more playable now. Obviously, taking a mana off the mana cost is always going to do that, but I think a lot of the issues with Wingbright Thief in its initial form was just that it was too expensive for the effects you're getting. Now at 2 mana, I'm definitely going to be trying this out in a few different shells in Alchemy. Then next up, Chittering Illuminator, and this is the card I'm most excited for, especially in Historic. I think this is definitely the rebalance card that is going to have the biggest impact in Historic. Now, having said that, I have thought about this card quite a lot, and I don't think it has a naturally good home right now, but getting this effect, being able to cast creatures off the top of your library on a 2 mana creature is really, really good, I think. I think it's definitely Historic power level, but I just don't think it's got a good home yet. And the awkward thing about Illuminator right now is that the way you have to build around this is just a super, super creature-heavy deck, right? Because the issue is, if you have this and you want to chain together a bunch of spells off the top of your deck, if you hit a land or a non-creature, that kind of stops it unless you have a way to scry, for example. So... and the issue with that is that running very creature-heavy decks in Historic right now leaves you very vulnerable to Hushbringer and Strict Proctor, which is seeing main deck play. If you're running all creatures, you don't have much room for interaction, which means you're going to struggle to deal with those sorts of ETB hate bear style effects. If you're not running that much interaction, you also struggle against combo decks quite a lot, right? There are some creatures that allow you to interact, like Juggernaut Peddler, but running green and white-black in this same deck is pretty awkward. So I think this is probably a case where the card is definitely up there in terms of power level, but either the deck that it's best in hasn't been found yet, or it's just not suited to the current metagame with, Strict Proctor, Hushbringer, combo decks everywhere. In terms of homes where I could see it seeing play, green is obviously going to be great for Devotion, but Devotion runs a lot of non-creatures. I have thought about potentially running a very creature-heavy version. You can run Grizzled Huntmaster instead of Karn. You could run, as like a finisher, you could run either the 3 mana Tyvar or the 4 mana Ulvenwald Oddity that allow you to just buff your whole board and attack for the win rather than relying on Karn to get you there. And there's a bunch of other, creature-based options that you could run. But having said that, I think some of the best cards in Devotion are non-creature. Utopia Sprawl, Kiora, Karn, Storm the Festival. So I'm not sure if running this would make that deck any better. There's also Elves, which again is a deck that hasn't seen play in a very long time, but I feel like Elves, not many people have tried it, probably because Goblin Bombardment is so punishing against you, but against non-bombardment decks, we still have Priest of Titania, and I think Priest of Titania plus Tyvar could work really well with Chittering Illuminator, because then it can enable you to have some, combo-based turns where, you cast a Priest of Titania off the top, then you can tap it immediately because of the Tyvar, which allows you to keep playing other creatures off the top. Then when you hit another Priest of Titania, or an Elvish Champion, not Elvish Champion, Oh, wow, I'm forgetting card names left, right, and centre. The 3-mana Elf Lord that also taps for green for the amount of creatures you've got. But if you run both of them and you're playing them off the top and then you can tap them immediately to Tyvar, you can just combo off the top of your deck fairly easily. So that could be one potential home. And then there's some combo decks as well. You could run it in as well. You could try and fit it into Samwise. You can try and fit it into Traveller combos. So there's a few different shells I'm going to try this card in, but this is definitely one that's going to be at the back of my mind for future metagames, future releases. This definitely feels like a historic playable card. And then Alchemy as well. I haven't really looked at mono green and Alchemy in a while, but this card is very, very pushed for Alchemy now. If mono green is viable against what the rest of the format's doing, then this card seems busted there. Again, I think the big restriction in Alchemy with whether this card is playable is largely down to the mana base, right? I think it's going to be tricky to run even a 2-color deck and consistently being able to have green on turn 2. So either way, very, very excited to try this one out in both formats. Then next up, we got Dazzling Flameweaver, which I believe the only change here is that you get to cast the card until the end of your next turn. So again, that's a very minor upgrade, I think. I don't think this card was really seeing much play even in Alchemy, so I very much doubt this is likely to see play. So those are the rebalances. A few that I'm very excited to try out again in Alchemy, like, for example, Wingbright Thief in a number of decks, and Chittering Illuminator is the one I'm definitely going to be spending the most time brewing around over the coming days. But we have a whole bunch of new cards coming out in the new Alchemy Aetherdrift set as well. And since this is kind of a small set, I'm going to go through all the cards rather than just picking out the best ones. So starting off here with Hangarback Assembler, which is a pretty interesting card. So basically, for 2 mana, you get Hangarback Walker for X=1, plus an additional artifact that stays on the battlefield, which obviously could be relevant if you have any affinity payoffs that you're running. And then once you hit max speed, you get to put counters on your stuff every single turn, which is a very powerful effect. Obviously, it's going to be quite slow if this is your only Start Your Engines card in the deck, but I'm quite excited to try this one out in Historic. I think Hardened Scales is a deck that has been neglected for a while now. I mean, I get that might just be because it's not good enough, but now with Hangarback Assembler and the latest Walker that we got from the latest set as well, we can potentially run 12 of these Walker-style effects, which means that we can afford to build around them more heavily. You know, you could maybe run the 2-mana Hardened Scales effect as well. You could maybe run some Sacrifice outlets. Obviously, we don't have access to Arcbound Ravager, which would be the best one, but, you know, I'm going to have a dig and see if there are some Sacrifice outlets that we can use to, you know, especially trigger the new Walker that allows you to draw a bunch. That seems very good to me. So definitely try it out in Historic for sure. Again, Hardened Scales hasn't been even in like tier 3 recently, so these might not be good enough to push it up to a top tier deck, but I'm definitely going to be trying it out. In terms of Alchemy, I'm not sure this has an immediate great home right now. There are some counter synergies and some artifact synergies, so I'm going to have to delve into that, see what I can do, but, you know, Hangarback Walker X=1 is a pretty powerful card, you know, especially in Alchemy where we can just start using the mana sink on it every single turn, and then, you know, there are more playable Start Your Engines cards as well, and if you can more consistently get this up to max speed, it seems very, very powerful as the payoff end as well. So definitely going to be trying this one out in both formats. And then next up we got Naktamun Shines Again, which is a really interesting one. Now initially I was really excited about this one because I thought the second chapter allowed you to tutor for a creature, so, you know, you could grab a Dollmaker if you just want to blink it, you could grab a Peddler if you want to go, you know, get rid of a card from the opponent's hand. Unfortunately, Seek is random here, right? So you don't get to tutor. However, I still think this is going to be a really powerful card, especially in Alchemy, right? You can run a very low to the ground aggressive deck. You can run this alongside a bunch of 2-drops. Dollmaker especially is going to be really good with this. Now, having said that, there is a bit of tension there because Dollmaker is typically good with token cards, which Naktamun Shines Again isn't really. I believe the way the first chapter works is they have to be creatures in your deck, right? If you produce tokens, I don't believe they'll get the perpetual +1/+1 because they don't count as creature cards when this triggers. So there is, I mean, but there are still creatures that you can blink with Dollmaker and stuff. So I'm definitely going to be looking at trying to build an aggro deck in Alchemy with this. In Historic, I do think this is interesting, but I think the biggest issue is that it just conflicts with Luris, right? Naktamun Shines Again incentivizes you to run a bunch of 1 and 2 mana creatures, and if you're running a bunch of 1 and 2 mana creatures, I very much doubt that you would prefer to play this over Luris. Again, if the chapter 2 could Seek and you could kind of, you know, grab a Dollmaker, blink it, get another trigger, grab another creature, that would be Historic power level for sure. But since Seek is random And that also produces some difficulties in deck building where you really don't want to be running multiples of the same legendary creature, because then you could just risk wasting Chapter 2 entirely. So I'm not sure this is really going to see play in Historic unless there's some cute combo I've not thought about, because it's just directly conflicting with Lurrus. But this definitely seems like a very nice tool for aggro decks in Alchemy. The next up, we've got Turbocharged Escape, which is never going to see play in Historic. It's just way too expensive. In Alchemy, obviously, this is an option for a sweeper, but I believe we already have 4-mana options, so I'm not really sure this is likely to see play. Obviously, the upside of being able to turn one of your vehicles into an artifact perpetually is an upside, but I haven't seen too many vehicle-centric decks at the top tiers anyway, so I think this is unlikely to see a lot of play there. Then next up, we got Deviant Skytech, which, you know, I always look at these cards for Historic, but I think this is just too expensive. Obviously, if you did play this on Historic, it would likely be in a Retrofit Foundry deck, right? Getting 2 Thopters for 3 mana. Bit too steep, though, you know, and that's the flaw of the card, really. You can't rely on the max speed, so very unlikely to see play in Historic. In Alchemy, though, I mean, we do have some synergies with Thopters, but again, I haven't really seen any artifact synergy decks being good, and 3 mana for 2 Thopters, unless you have a way to utilize those, like a Retrofit of Foundry style effect, I'm not sure is likely to see play there either. But again, like I said, I haven't played best of 3 in a few weeks at this point, so if there is an artifact synergy deck that you think this could slot into, definitely let me know. I'd love to be brought up to speed on that. The next time we got Surge of Acclaim, which is a pretty interesting cantrip style effect here. So I mean, it's going to be at its best in decks with Start Your Engines, but I think it is important to note that you can potentially use this to tutor a card. So if there is a card with Start Your Engines that's central to your deck's game plan, then you can use this to tutor it if it's the only card with Start Your Engines in your deck. I don't, you know, I've had a quick look through all the Start Your Engines cards, and nothing came up to me in initial viewing as something that you would really want to be tutoring with this. In terms of using this fairly, I mean, it is a straight 1-for-1. You do seek a non-land card at worst, which means you're guaranteed to find gas. Now, having said that, having played with Seek New Knowledge quite a lot, that can actually be a downside if you need to find lands. But, you know, the fact it has Jumpstart, the fact that you can get both when you are at max speed does mean that if there is, you know, maybe a control deck with a bunch of Start Your Engines cards, this could be a good payoff there as well, but I'm not sure. I don't feel like there's a good deck for this yet in Alchemy. And then in Historic, I just feel like we have way better options than this. Like I said, if there was like a combo piece with Start Your Engines, then this could be a good way to tutor it when you need and just get another card when you don't. But as things stand, I don't think there's anything that works with this yet. Then Trackhand Trainer is pretty interesting as well. Now, Training Grounds, we haven't really seen any Alchemy decks built around this, but if you do need to find Training Grounds consistently for your game plan, I love this style of effect where you get a creature, pump some mana into it, and then that generates another card for you. I think the biggest issue is there isn't a Training Grounds deck in either format, but if there is, especially in Alchemy, this is definitely one that I'm interested in because you get a lot of value for 1 mana off this, right? You get a Trackhand Trainer, a Training Grounds, and a card once that's in play as well, all for relatively cheap. So value-wise, this card seems really good to me, but I just don't think it has a good home yet in either format, really. Then next time we got Bailout, which is kind of, you know, we've seen this, variations of this effect a lot. In Timeless, this sees play to kind of scam your Grief and your other Evoke Elementals into play. In Alchemy and Historic, these effects basically see no play whatsoever, and I don't really think this is even an upgrade on the existing ones that we have, so I doubt this one's going to see play in either format, unfortunately. Spectacle of Destruction, though, is a pretty interesting one. So this is kind of a Phyrexian Arena, adjacent effect, but you need to be killing the opponent's creatures in order to trigger it, which isn't a difficult thing to be doing. So I do think this is potentially worth trying in just mid-range decks. You know, my initial read on this card was that it would be too slow for Historic, and I still think it probably is. I think if you're playing a mid-range adjacent list in Historic right now, you should just be focusing on trying to get a Lender into play as quickly as possible rather than drawing cards off this, but I do think if you are running a lot of interaction, this card is potentially Historic playable, and then in Alchemy, this card seems great as well. Again, you do need your interaction to be killing creatures rather than exiling, but that's not really a jump, that's not really a hoop you have to jump through too much, really. You know, most of the good quality interaction in Alchemy right now is distraction based. Obviously some exile, but definitely think this card has the potential to see play in Alchemy. Maybe at some point in Historic as well, but I just don't really feel like this is the direction you want to be taking interactive decks in Historic. Then next up we got Speedbrood Stalker, which is one of my favourite designs in this set. I love, you know, I can't wait to cast this card in Alchemy because the mind games seem really cool in this. So the floor of this card is just force the opponent to sacrifice their most problematic creature, but then there's the mind games of, okay, the opponent might think we're trying to sacrifice their biggest creature and pick that, but then if we pick another one, we get to get rid of 2 of them. Either way, I still think for 5 mana, even if you both choose their best creature, this isn't bad for Alchemy anyway. I very much doubt this is going to see play in Historic. You know, it is a powerful effect, but it's at that awkward mana cost where it's too expensive to hardcast and too cheap to want to cheat into play. But in Alchemy, this card does seem good. It's a decently sized flying body that, you know, gets rid of 1 or potentially even 2 of their best things. So I'm definitely going to be trying this one out in Alchemy, but I just think it's too expensive for Historic, really. The next one we got Terrors of the Track, which is kind of like similar to Blood Artist, but it only triggers once each turn. However, it does have double team, meaning that if you get 2, you know, if you attack and get a second one in play, you can double up on that sort of thing. But typically these sorts of effects, at least in Historic, you need them to not be once per turn, so I very much doubt it's going to see play there. In Alchemy, though, you know, this does seem reasonable value. I think, especially if you're playing a deck built around flyers, you know, you could run this alongside the Awestruck Signet, maybe, and then you get double team on this, which then gives you another flyer to cast, so that could be a potentially good home. And then once you have both of these in play, they can drain, so you could maybe run it in the Bats deck as well. Obviously, it not being a Bat itself is a, you know, tiny bit of mis-synergy there, but you know, this is going to start gaining you life for your, I forgot the name of it now, Golden Sidekick, that's the one. And then, you know, going to start getting in, you know, 2/1 fly for 2 mana is fairly aggressive stats for Alchemy. So I wouldn't be surprised if this does see play in Alchemy, maybe in the Bats deck, maybe alongside Awestruck Signet, but I just think it's just not good enough for Historic, unfortunately. The next time we got Unforgiving Overtake, which is an interesting removal spell in that it damages the opponent as opposed to you. You know, usually we've seen from cards like Infernal Grasp, downside of a lot of efficiently costed black removal spells is they deal you damage. This one deals damage to the opponent instead, but it's sorcery speed and it costs 3 mana when you're on the play, so I just think there are better options in both formats, unfortunately. Maybe if you're running a deck that really cares about the chip damage, then you could consider this, but as things stand, I'm not sold on this one in either format, really. Then next up, we got Chomping Mastasaur. So this is, again, in Historic, this kind of falls into that category where it's too expensive to hardcast, but probably not powerful enough to cheat into play. You know, if we had a 20 power... a 20 cost card where you could cheat this into play, discard the 20 cost card and dome the opponent for 20, maybe it's worth considering cheating into play there, but I think we just generally have better options. In Alchemy, I mean, there are still a decent number of dinosaurs in the format, so you could maybe run this in as top end there, and then, you know, you get to dome the opponent for a lot of damage. You are naturally going to be running a lot of expensive cards anyway, so this could be worth trying out in Alchemy Dinosaurs, but outside of that, I don't really expect this one to have a massive impact. And next up, we got Goblin Crash Pilot, which, again, you know, this isn't going to see play in Historic. It's just not fast enough. In Alchemy, again, I haven't seen any vehicle-centric decks recently. Like I said, I haven't really played Best of 3 in the past few weeks. So if there is a vehicle deck that this can slot very nicely into, I'd be interested to hear. But yeah, unless there is a vehicle deck that is very aggressive, I don't really see this one seeing play. If there is, then maybe, right? This, you know, it allows you to crew up vehicles you play and give them haste, then sacrifice them and deal extra damage, which does apply a lot of pressure. So if there is good vehicles to run alongside this, I could see it being good. I'm just not sure there is right now. So next up, we got Kari Zev Crew 2, and I love the flavor on this one. It's sick. And I do think this one could be good as like top end in Alchemy aggro decks, right? You play this on turn 4, you can attack in straight away. It has Menaced, which definitely goes a long way to mitigate 3/3 being quite poor stats for a 4-mana creature. But when you attack, you get to conjure a Ragavan into play. If that connects, then you get to get a treasure token and get the, you know, potentially cast the top card of the opponent's deck. And then that goes back to your hand, which means that you could potentially build up an army of Ragavans in your hand if this starts attacking every single turn. You don't really care if the Ragavan gets blocked because you can just create another one the following turn. So red aggro decks, I'm definitely going to be trying this out at the top end of there. Historic is just too slow. Like I said, these 4 and 5 mana creatures need to have a huge impact on the game to even be worth considering. So, Alchemy aggro decks, I'm definitely going to be trying this one out though. The next up, we've got Motivated Muralist, which is a really interesting card. I love these sorts of effects that kind of curve out where you can cast this on turn 2, consistently get the statuary, and then play it on turn 3 to potentially combo off the following turn. Now, having said that, statuary itself is this card if you're not aware, and it is in theory going to be a good combo enabler, but we have better options already. So, if you're not aware, I know Greenwire has been doing a lot of work on decks in Historic built around Tamiyo Meets the Circle and Archway of Innovation, where you cast this, you can discard a bunch of cards to create a ton of clue tokens, and then you can use Archway of Innovation, give you an next spell, Improvise, and then just cast a really expensive colorless spell on turn 3. You could, in theory, do that with Inspiring Statuary instead, but you have to use 3 of your mana as opposed to 1. It's way more vulnerable to interaction because it's an artifact as opposed to a land. And if you are doing this Inspiring Statuary thing, I feel like you're better off just running Statuary itself because, then you don't have to waste turn 2 and 3 on, Motivated Muralist into Inspiring Statuary. Not to mention, I just don't think we have that many good enablers for this sort of effect. I think Tamiyo Meets the Story Circle is a really unique card that can put a ton of artifacts into play very early on. We don't really have many other cards that can do that, which you really need for Inspiring Statuary to be good. So this is one that I've got my eye on. If there are cards that enable Statuary, then this could be a really interesting card to return to. But right now, I think Tamiyo and Archway work really well together. I think if you started replacing that with Statuary and Muralist, your curve becomes really awkward. You put a lot of extra steps in there. You're moving into red, which isn't really a colour that deck wants to be in naturally. So one for the future, I think. To be honest, I don't think Inspiring Statuary is that good, so there's a chance this never sees play, but I don't think we have enough pieces for this card to be good yet, anyway. The next time we got Smog Smasher, which, again, is an interesting card in Alchemy. I think this is just going to be too slow for Historic. But, it is an interesting top-end card, but I just don't see what home would really want this. If you're running an aggro deck, 5 mana is very expensive, and I think you'd much rather run a card like Kari Zev instead. And you really want to be running this alongside other creatures because you want to be able to trigger this every single turn. So I don't know. It kind of feels like a card you'd maybe run in a mid-range deck, but, we still have stuff like Tajik Legal, which is just significantly better than this. So this just feels like a card that, it does do something powerful if your deck can enable it, but I just feel like it's too expensive, even for Alchemy. Then next up we got Fuel Tank Feaster, and this card seems really good to me. This is basically like a double 2-mana dork, right? It's a conventional dork in the sense that you just play it, and then if it survives, you can tap it for mana, but you also get to start discounting creatures in your hand as well. So this seems pretty good to me. In terms of Historic, I don't think it has a good natural home right now. Obviously, if you are ramping, Devotion is the first deck that comes to mind, but I don't think you want to be running more than Fanatic of Ronus at the 2-drop slot for ramp anyway, and I feel like Fanatic is so much better than Fuel Tank Feaster because it just snowballs the game really quickly, especially if you can untap it with Kiora. But I do think there could be a new deck because I've been trying out Fountain Port Charmer as well. There's a combo deck that I've already, I've been working on for a while that I'm going to be covering in a video very soon, but I'm tempted to even look at another deck where you just run creatures that benefit from being discounted, because running this alongside Fountain Port Charmer, this can really lead to explosive starts. Now, again, the big issue with discounting cards is it only discounts colorless mana, which means that, say you got a card that costs double green and 2. Once you've used Fountain Port Charmer, Fuel Tank Feaster isn't going to be doing anything to that card because it already costs as cheap as it can. So I don't know if you would want to run these alongside a bunch of X-Cost cards maybe. But then again, X-Cost cards, X-Cost creatures specifically aren't good enough to see play on their own, so they're bad when you don't have your discounted effects. But either way, I'm excited to try this because I do feel like there is kind of like an unexplored area there where Fountain Port Charmer has impressed me even in Historic, and so getting another sort of this style of effect where you can also discount other stuff, it feels worth trying to build around. I'm not sure we have enough pieces, but I'm definitely going to try it. And then in terms of Alchemy, this just seems phenomenal there as well, right? If this card is even worth trying in Historic, it's probably going to be good in Alchemy, right? Like I said, it's just a 2-mana dork that ramps you twice, essentially, if it gets to survive. So, and like I said, with the Chittering Illuminator, I'm very interested in trying mono green. This seems like an excellent card to be running in mono green, so very, very excited to try this one out. The next up, we got Great Fang Chroniclers. So I don't actually have up the card that it conjures, but it basically, I believe, gives all creatures with no abilities +2/+2. So I guess the idea here is that you activate it, it removes the ability, and then you can buff it with that. Now, having said that, for the card that you conjure to be good, you need to be running a bunch of cards that either have no text at all, which makes them bad cards to run anyway, or have exhaust abilities, which, remove the ability, so they then get the buff. Either way, this just feels like a card that is... I mean, it's a cool card. I like the design on it, but it doesn't feel competitive to me, right? The only way this is viable is alongside a bunch of other creatures that can remove their effects as well, but it just feels too slow to me. Then next up, we got Mitotic Ultimus. Not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but this is kind of an interesting card. It kind of reminds me of Galter a little bit. Again, too slow for Historic, I think. It just doesn't do enough, and it takes a little while to get online. I think if it had more of an immediate impact on the game, it would be worth considering. In Alchemy, though, where things are a lot slower, and this kind of card can afford to... you're not worrying about dying to combo decks quickly going over the top of you as much anyway. This card definitely seems playable there, and like I said, I'm very excited to try mono green out because of Chittering Illuminator, and this seems like a sick card to be casting off the top of your deck, if you can discount it down to 2 greens. So yeah, I'd be very, very excited to try this one out in Alchemy. Don't think it's going to be good enough for Historic though. The next time we got Routeway Mouse, which is kind of like another saddle payoff. Again, we haven't really seen, obviously some saddle cards see play on their own merit, but we haven't really seen a deck that's built around it be viable. So I think this is a reasonable card, right? It's a 2-mana 3/3, which is good stats for mono green. And if you're running saddle, other cards that enable you to saddle, you can start benefiting from this. I don't think Alchemy is at the point where you just want to be running a 2-mana 3/3. So you do need to be running other saddle cards for this to be good, which I don't think, is likely to be the case. Maybe if you're in black-green, for example. So this feels like a card where it could be playable if there were better standalone saddle cards, but... as things stand, I don't really think there are, so I wouldn't be surprised if this one doesn't see any play, really. The next time we got Arius Flyby Trawler. And this one does seem good to me in Alchemy for sure, right? So whenever it attacks, you get to seek a card. You discard it during the end step, which is typically a downside. So the whole idea here is that, I guess, you're forced to cast the card that you seek, otherwise you lose it. But you do also get bonuses when you discard cards as well, so... I'm not sure we have great enablers for discarding, but this card kind of just enables itself, right? Even if you don't start buffing it, a 2-mana 1/1 that just gets you an extra card every single turn is just good enough on its own, I think. And then, if you happen to hit a card that you can't cast, for example, you do start buffing it. So this card could be good. I mean, Shark Pirate, we do have some synergies alongside that, but if you're just running an Izzet deck where you want just repeatable value every single turn, then this seems good to me. It is slightly awkward that it discards if you're running conditional stuff like counter spells or, removal that only targets creatures, for example. But, it does have some kind of insurance against that, in that if you do seek a card you can't cast, it buffs the Arius anyway. So I think this is definitely high enough power level for Alchemy. I'm just not sure what the best home for it would be. In Historic... again, it's an interesting effect, but, we just have way better alternatives for this, right? If it was a wizard, then we'd be maybe talking, you could maybe slot it into Izzet Wizards, but, we already have Tamio, we already have Psychic Frog that basically does the same thing as this, but is just better, right? It's kind of interesting that we recently got Marauding Mako, and this is also another payoff for... discarding a bunch, so you can maybe run this alongside Marauding Mako there, but typically I think the Madness decks are better off splashing white for Flage than blue, but I'll definitely be looking at the blue cards you could get in this sort of deck, and it could be worth trying there. But yeah, definitely one that I'm going to be trying out in Alchemy for sure. The next time we got Highway Reaver. So this is a pretty interesting one. Gives a creature Unearth whenever it enters or attacks. So if you don't know, Unearth is an ability where you can bring a creature back from the graveyard and it has haste but exiles itself during the end step. Now on its own, this card doesn't really seem that good to me, even in Alchemy. I think the deck that this will be playable in is a deck that has cards that start your engines very early on, because if you're having to unearth a creature for its mana cost, that's not great. If you can unearth it for 0, then you can potentially turn this into a combo card, right? You can potentially have a bunch of other cards that start your engines, a way to discard a big creature into the graveyard, give it unearth for 0, and then just deal, a huge attack out of nowhere. That seems like the best way to use this. So maybe in Alchemy, if there is a deck that can fulfill all those requirements, this could be worth looking at. But outside of that, if you're just using this as a value card, I mean, if you do have max speed, it does seem good. So even if you're not trying to cheat a massive creature into play, this could be a good kind of top end payoff if you're running a bunch of cheap cards with start your engine so that you can get to max speed. But if you're not getting to max speed, within a turn or two of this coming down, this doesn't seem very good to me personally. And then, I just don't think it's going to be anywhere near good enough for Historic. Ornate Imitations, this seems like a card that I'm going to love casting, but I think, unfortunately, the decks that can afford to cast this are probably going to go for Doppelganger instead, because that's a guaranteed kill, whereas this isn't. I mean, this is likely going to win you the game on the following turn if you do have access to a ton of mana, but I just think Doppelgang is probably just going to be the better option, unfortunately. But I'm still going to be casting this one because it's such a sick, fun card. I love it. And then, yeah, obviously not going to be good enough for Historic because of that. And then we got Quickbeast Amulet, which is an interesting payoff, but I think if this gave trample or some form of evasion as well, it would be pretty good. So I guess the idea with this card is you just cast it on turn 2, swarm the board, then equip it to like a flyer or something, then it can get a ton of extra power. But I don't know, I just feel like there are better payoffs for going wide. I think I would much rather run an Anthem effect or a Convoke payoff like Buxton. This is kind of awkward in the fact that you need it early, but you need to take a turn off to cast it, which reduces the amount of pressure you're applying. And if you're a deck going wide, pressure applying is like the whole point of playing a deck like that. And then if you draw it off the top when you already have a full board, this seems really bad as well. So this seems like a cool card, but I've been burnt by enough of these cards in the past to know that it's probably just not going to be good enough in either format, I don't think. Then next up we got Salad Deck Boss, which is a pretty interesting build around. Obviously, you want to be running this alongside a bunch of other creatures with exhaust. So, I mean, that alone means it's never going to see play in Historic. That sort of deck is just not going to be good enough. In Alchemy, I have had a look at the cards with exhaust, and I don't know. I could see you could build a deck around this, but I'm just not really sure it would be that good, to be honest. Giving a creature's haste is pretty nice, especially because some of the exhaust cards are aggressively slanted, and you do get to double up on the triggers as well, but I don't know, it just feels like there's not enough payoffs to build your whole deck around that sort of thing, right? If this card was in green and it gave you, it was cheaper to activate and gave you more payoffs for being an exhaust deck, then maybe, but I don't know, it just feels like Salah on its own isn't really good enough to build a whole deck around that. And it doesn't, the other exhaust cards, some of them are reasonable, but like I said, I just feel like the overall card quality would be too low for it to be good, if that makes sense. And the next one we got Support Skyforge. So this comes down as a vehicle, creates 4 tokens, which you can obviously use to crew the Skyforge, so it kind of enables itself. And then when the Skyforge attacks, you get to crew a vehicle from its spellbook, which we can see here. So it's basically just a bunch of other vehicles. Some of them good, some of them bad. Obviously, Smugglers, Copter, and Sky Sovereign, definitely the most powerful of these. And since you do get to look at 3, I believe, you do have a decent chance of finding a good one here. So it's kind of like, it is a threat that snowballs the game over time. It is a vehicle, so you could potentially run it in Greasefang decks as well. If you did think about how this would work with Greasefang, you bring it back from the graveyard, you get 4 tokens. They don't have flying, unfortunately, so that means you are kind of vulnerable to them attacking in the air on the following turn. But you get 4 tokens, you attack, and then you get to draft a card from the spellbook as well. Seems okay, seems reasonable, but again, I don't think it's really better than bringing back a Sky Sovereign. We also got some probably better vehicles for Greasefang in the main Aetherdrift set as well. So I'm just trying to think of all the places you could potentially play it in Historic. Greasefang is the only one that really comes to mind. In Alchemy, again, this is a powerful payoff if you're running a deck with vehicles, but it is kind of expensive at 5 mana, so unless there's a deck that is really all in on vehicles, I don't really see this thing playing Alchemy. And outside of Greasefang, which I'm not even sure about. I don't expect this to see play in Historic either. Then next up we got Sargon Raider Warlord. So this is a payoff if you're running a deck with creatures with first strike and double strike, which is a really interesting build around. And there are a number of good creatures that you could run alongside this, but I don't. Again, similar with Salad Deck Boss, I don't think it's worth building your whole deck around Sargon. Typically, if you're building your whole deck around something, you want at least 2 payoffs. Otherwise, you're just running a bunch of suboptimal cards on the hope that you draw your 4 of to then get a big power level spike. And then the max speed ability isn't that important. I guess it enables itself to the point where if you are running creatures without first strike, it now gives your creatures first strike, so then you can buff your whole board quite a lot. So I guess you could also run this alongside Start Your Engines cards, just as another payoff. And I think I like that more. I think because you don't have to build too heavily around that, you just need to run cards with Start Your Engines, although rather than first strike or double strike, and then there's typically more payoff for doing that, if that makes sense. But again, I'm not really sure this is worth it in Alchemy, and then because of that, obviously not going to see play in Historic, but I'm definitely going to try building around this one, but it strikes me as a card that probably isn't worth building around. The next up we got Wish Good Luck. So this is one that I am pretty excited about for Historic, specifically because of creativity. This producing 3 tokens, one of them being a treasure token, is huge at enabling creativity for X equals 2. Even on its own, you just play this on turn 2. You can play creativity on turn 3 with this, right? You just use a treasure token to pay for the 4th mana, and then you can target either your food or the vehicle, which is really nice. And then, you can potentially go Strike It Rich on 1, Wish Me Good Luck on turn 2, and then maybe go X equals 2 on turn 3, which is huge. Now, typically the big issue with creativity in Historic has just been the lack of good payoffs, right? We still don't have Archon of Cruelty. However, I have actually been impressed with Ashen Rider recently. I have tried this card in creativity, and it has really impressed me, especially if you get creativity early, right? Because you can use this to exile lands. So if you can get creativity X equals 2 on turn 3 by going Strike It Rich into... I forget the name of it already. Not good with the memory today. Wish Good Luck. That's the one. So if you go strike It Rich into Wish Good Luck, into Creativity X equals 2, double Ashen Rider your 2 lands, that's a pretty powerful start. The issue with that is that I'm not sure what the rest of the deck looks like. Obviously, the big upside of having Ashen Rider in your deck is that it's non-legendary, so you could try and do the similar to Modern thing where they persist Archon of Cruelty as well. We do have Faithless Looting, so we can potentially persist this on turn 2. My issue with that is that you've only got 4 payoffs for your reanimation targets, which is a little bit awkward, right? If you run other creatures outside of Ashen Rider, then your creativity isn't guaranteed to find Ashen Rider, which is like the whole point of running this card with creativity. I guess you could run a one of like Serra's Emissary or Atraxa or whatever the case may be. But if you've only got 4 creatures and you're running Faithless Looting, which is card negative, and that kind of incentivizes you to want to be running more graveyard payoffs, because otherwise you're just going negative off Faithless Looting every single time, and if you don't have Ashen Rider, that's not ideal. And same thing with Persist. If you've only got 4 reanimation targets, I don't know how consistently you're going to be using the Persist either, so I'm definitely going to be working on it. It definitely seems where the power level of the curves that this card enables is definitely worth trying out. I'm just not really sure what the rest of the deck would look like built around it. If you have an idea of how you would build around Wish Good Luck, whether you would go with a graveyard plan alongside Persist, definitely let me know, because this is definitely going to be one of the first decks I'm working on once I actually get to grips with the cards. The next time we got Masterpiece Vault, which is a card I don't really understand. Like it's a cool card, but I'm just not really sure where it fits. So basically, when it gets sent to the graveyard, you get to draft a card from its spellbook, which is basically just a bunch of pieces of equipment, Champion's Herb, Lightning Greaves, and then all of the different swords here, which is nice. Now, I guess one of the nice things about this card is that you can just draft a sword which gives you protection from the color of creatures your opponent's running, which is pretty nice, right? If you decided to run, I don't know, Sword of Feast and I guess you can't actually run Sword of Feast and Famine in the main deck because it's not craftable, which is kind of funny. But the downside of running these swords on their own is that there are going to be some matchups where they're excellent, some matchups where they're very bad. So getting to draft the one which is good in any given situation and equip it is pretty nice. There are sacrifice outlets that do let you trigger this the turn it comes down. You've got stuff like Oni-Cult Anvil, but again, that's in Historic, and Anvil hasn't been playable in years. I don't think this card is really going to be, the thing that pushes it over the edge. So I think if you are going to be running this, it's probably going to be an Alchemy, and I'm not sure what the best shell for this would be, really. We don't have too many payoffs for getting equipments in play. We don't have that many cards that can sacrifice artifacts for free, I don't believe. So, and spending 8 mana on this seems really bad to me, right? You get a sword and equip it, which is 5 mana worth, and even that's not that good on certain board states. So this does feel like one where I definitely could be missing something. So if I am, definitely let me know in the comments, because this does seem like a card that could do cool things in certain decks. But so those are all the cards I'm going to be looking at today. Obviously not every card's going to be a banger, and I do think there are some cards in here that are unlikely to see play even in Alchemy, which is a shame. But there are some cards that I do think could be Historic playable as well. I think Hangarback Assembler could be good in Hardened Scales. What else? I think Fuel Tank Feaster could be playable in a ramp deck that is looking to discount cards, especially alongside Fountain Port Charmer. I think Wish Good Luck enables some pretty crazy curves with creativity as well. Not to mention Chittering Illuminator, which I'm really, really excited to get my hands on and start playing around as well. So there are some really cool cards in here. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any applications of these cards that I didn't think of, any decks they could fit into, any combos especially that I missed out on. That's always a big one. Let me know what cards or what's been working well for you as well, because the set is out. I'm sure some people have had time to start testing with this. So if there's any cards in here that you think are underrated from what I've said, definitely let me know as well. And then, like I said, I've got a premium article coming out this weekend that will basically be breaking down all of the different lists that I'm trying, what's working well, what's not, what could potentially be, a top tier deck if I do end up getting something that's working out. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video though, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big up.